A wealthy but emotionally distant CEO, Elijah Cole, takes his 6-year-old daughter Ivy to a local street fair as part of his court-mandated family bonding sessions after his messy divorce. At the fair, Ivy spots a frail single mother named Liana and her starving son Liam sharing one small piece of bread. Innocently, Ivy tugs on Elijah's sleeve and asks, "Daddy, she's hungry. Can we buy it for her?" Her simple plea sets off an emotional chain of events. Elijah, haunted by his past mistakes, shockingly agrees buying them food, then offering help that turns into something much deeper. As their lives intersect, hidden traumas surface. Liana's past as a college music prodigy who lost everything in a house fire, and Elijah's guilt over ignoring his own struggling sister who died homeless years ago. Through connection, faith, and unexpected moments of grace, the 3 adults and 2 children begin healing. But their path is not smooth media attention, corporate backlash, and Liana's pride threaten to unravel everything. At its heart, this is a story about how one moment of compassion from a child can spark a journey of redemption, purpose, and profound change. The Saturday sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft orange hue over the town square as laughter, music, and the scent of caramel popcorn drifted through the summer air. The community fair was in full swing. Children ran between booths, balloons danced overhead, and the scent of roasted corn mingled with fried dough and funnel cakes. It should have felt festive, joyous, but for Elijah Cole, nothing about this afternoon felt right. He stood stiffly near the carousel, hands deep in the pockets of his tailored slacks, watching his 6-year-old daughter Ivy hop down from a painted white horse. Her brown curls bounced as she ran toward him, face glowing from the ride. She was all brightness and warmth, the opposite of the man beside her, whose steel-gray eyes scanned the crowd not with curiosity but calculation. He hadn't wanted to come. His assistant had reminded him 3 times that the parenting counselor recommended shared activities outside the home. And so here he was, among sticky-fingered children and strangers with loud voices, far from his climate-controlled office and predictable calendar. "Daddy, that was so fun," Ivy beamed, tugging on his sleeve. "Can we get ice cream now?" He glanced at his Rolex, suppressing a sigh. "Sure. 1, then we leave." They walked together toward a row of food stalls, Ivy skipping ahead and Elijah trailing behind, tugged by obligation rather than desire. As they passed a bench shaded by a crooked tree, Ivy suddenly stopped. Elijah didn't notice at first until she tugged on his pants leg. "Daddy," she whispered, eyes wide, voice small. "She's hungry." Elijah followed her gaze. Sitting quietly on the bench was a woman, no older than 30, cradling a thin, curly-haired boy on her lap. The boy, maybe 4, clutched a single sandwich half-eaten and soggy from too much handling. The woman tore off a small piece and placed it gently into the boy's mouth before offering nothing to herself. Her clothes were clean but worn, her eyes tired. The child's shirt was missing a button. His shoes didn't match. Elijah's expression didn't change, but Ivy wasn't finished. Can we buy it for her?" she asked, motioning to the ice cream in her hand. "Just 1 or 2. I have my coins." The world seemed to slow. Her voice was so earnest, so unfiltered. She held out her tiny coin purse, jingling with less than $1 in change. She looked up at him not with manipulation, but with raw compassion. He opened his mouth, prepared to say no, to explain that it wasn't their business, that the woman might be dangerous, that it could be a scam, but nothing came out. Instead, after a long moment, Elijah said something he hadn't said in years, maybe not ever. "All right," Ivy blinked. "Really?" He nodded, quietly surprised by his own answer. Go pick something. We'll get two. Minutes later, they stood in front of the food stall with 2 hot dogs and a bottle of water. Elijah stayed back as Ivy approached the woman, holding out the food with a shy smile. The woman looked stunned. She stood slowly, cautious, her hands trembling. I thank you, but she began, glancing at Elijah. Unsure, he stepped forward. My daughter insisted. Please, no strings. The woman's eyes searched his face. She accepted the food, but not the water. Thank you, she whispered. As the boy bit into the hot dog, Ivy sat beside him, giggling at his messy cheeks. The woman remained silent, back straight, pride still intact. Elijah didn't sit. He just stood there, uncertain, watching. And for the first time in a long while, something shifted in him, not guilt, not duty, something deeper, something that began with a question he didn't expect from a child who saw what he hadn't. The fair continued around them, but Elijah no longer heard the music or laughter. He only saw the woman's face as she tore another piece of food for her son, and the way her eyes met his strong, guarded, and still holding on. The bench creaked beneath their weight as Ivy scooted closer to the little boy, whose name they learned was Liam. He was shy at first, clutching his half-eaten hot dog like a treasure, but Ivy had a way of melting walls. Within minutes, they were whispering about balloons and racing clouds, giggling over mustard stains and ketchup smudges. Elijah remained standing, hands in his coat pockets, casting sidelong glances at the woman who still hadn't introduced herself. She sat upright, careful, watching her son with the eyes of someone who had learned not to expect kindness without consequence. Her posture was proud, but her body was tired. The plastic bag beside her held only a spare shirt, a small blanket, and a wrinkled grocery receipt. Eventually, she spoke. I didn't mean to cause a scene, she said, her voice calm but low, guarded. Your daughter, she's very kind. He looked down at Ivy, who now held Liam's hand like they were old friends. She gets that from her mother. The woman nodded, understanding too well the weight of that past tense. Elijah Cole, he said finally, as if that would somehow make things simpler. She blinked. I know. There was no arrogance in his tone, and no awe in hers. Just recognition. A billionaire in a public park wasn't exactly invisible. Even dressed down in jeans and a button-up shirt, the stories in the papers, the divorce, the scandals, the foundation, the boardroom battles she had read enough to know his face. She shifted slightly. Liana, just that. No last name, no job title, no follow-up. He studied her delicate fingers, her scraped knuckles, the faint callus at the base of her thumb. She didn't look like someone who begged. She didn't carry the air of someone who had given up. If anything, she looked like someone still quietly fighting a war. Where are you staying? He asked, before he could stop himself. Her head snapped up. We're fine. It wasn't anger in her voice, it was something more fragile. Fear of pity, fear of being seen. I didn't mean... He paused. Ivy's just worried. And I suppose I am too. Liana softened. Just slightly. We stay at a friend's place when we can. We keep moving. It's safer that way. He wanted to ask safer from what, but something in her eyes warned him not to. He nodded instead, grounding himself in the moment. Ivy offered her water to Liam, who took it with both hands like it was sacred. Liana reached for it, to make sure he didn't spill. Do you work? He asked. Sometimes. She paused. When people let me. He didn't know what to say to that. He didn't want to sound like he was offering charity, or worse, a transaction. And yet, he felt responsible somehow for the state of the world she was surviving in. "You play Ivy?" suddenly asked, pointing at the worn violin case tucked under the bench. Liana hesitated. "Used to." "Can you play now?" Liana glanced at Elijah, as if asking permission. He didn't speak, only nodded. With slow, practiced hands, she pulled out the violin. The wood was chipped and weathered, but it had clearly been cared for. She adjusted the strings, lifted the bow, and began to play. The first notes floated into the air like whispers, fragile, tender, aching. People turned. Conversations quieted. Even the carousel slowed. Elijah had heard orchestras, private concerts, luxury galas filled with perfectly tuned strings, but he had never heard something so raw. Liana's eyes closed, her fingers dancing on the neck of the violin as if it were part of her body. The music told a story of loss, of rain on windows, of nights without rest. It spoke of motherhood, of hunger, of grace. It lasted less than 2 minutes, but it changed the mood of the square. When she stopped, the silence was thunderous. Then someone clapped, then another, then dozens more. A few people left money on the bench. Respectfully, Liana didn't reach for it. Ivy looked up at her, wide-eyed. That was beautiful. Liana managed a faint smile, then gently placed the violin back into its case. "I haven't played in a long time," she murmured. Elijah had no words. He only knew that something inside him had stirred something unfamiliar, like the ache of something once lost, or the recognition of something important. He looked at her again, not as a stranger, not as someone broken, but as someone deeply whole in a world that had done everything to shatter her. And for the first time that day, he didn't want to leave. They sat in silence for a long while after the music faded. The fair around them returned to its usual pace. Kids screaming from the spinning rides. Vendors calling out offers. Smells of cotton candy and grilled meat thick in the air. But the little bench beneath the crooked tree felt like a separate world, one that still echoed with Liana's melody. Elijah couldn't stop staring at the violin case. It was old, the edges frayed and patched with duct tape. One of the latches didn't quite close, but it had clearly been handled with love. Not the kind of love reserved for a hobby, but the kind that comes from something lived earned through pain, repetition, and purpose. He cleared his throat. "You were trained, weren't you? That wasn't beginner's talent." Liana gently smoothed the case shut, her gaze not meeting his. "I studied at Westbridge Conservatory, full scholarship, violin performance major." He blinked. That was one of the top arts programs in the country. What happened? The question hung in the air like smoke. Liana didn't answer immediately. Instead, she helped Liam wipe ketchup from his chin with a napkin Ivy had handed him, her gestures automatic and motherly. "A fire," she said finally. "My apartment. Senior year." Elijah waited, unsure if she'd continue. "She did. I lost everything. My violin, my sheet music. My hands were burned. Not badly, but enough to make professors think I'd never regain full control. I missed recitals, missed finals. The scholarship was revoked." She paused. "By the time the scars healed, the rest of my life had fallen apart." He was quiet. She didn't speak like someone bitter. She spoke like someone who'd long accepted what she couldn't control. "After that," she said softly, "there was no more stage, just jobs, temporary shelters. My son." Her voice didn't tremble, but Elijah felt something in himself shift again. Not pity, he knew better than to insult her with that, but guilt. Guilt that he had once passed by people like her without a second thought. Guilt that his wealth, his position, his life all felt sterile and hollow next to what she carried. Ivy, oblivious to the heaviness in the air, clapped her hands. "I want to learn violin. Can you teach me?" Liana gave a tired chuckle. "I don't really teach anymore." "But you should," Ivy insisted. "You're better than my piano teacher. He smells like eggs." Even Liana laughed then, and Elijah saw something in her face soften, a flicker of the woman she had been. Maybe the one she could still become, but it vanished quickly. "We should go," Liana said quietly, rising and gathering their bag. "Thank you for the food." Elijah stood too. "Wait." She looked at him, guarded again. "You don't have to leave like this," he said. "I have resources, connections. I run a foundation. We support the arts, education." "Maybe I could know," she interrupted, firm but calm. "Please don't. I'm not trying to give you a handout." "I know," she said, "but people like me, we've learned that every offer has a weight, a price, even if you don't mean it that way." He fell silent, struck by her clarity. "I appreciate what you've done today," she continued, "but I don't want to owe you. Not for a meal, not for music." Liam tugged her sleeve. Ivy looked disappointed. Elijah could have walked away then. Let her go. Let the moment pass like thousands before it, but something rooted him in place. Maybe it was Ivy's wide, pleading eyes. Maybe it was the memory of his sister, who had once called him from a payphone, begging for help he never sent. He took out his business card and placed it gently on the bench. "No expectations," he said. "Just if you ever need a safe place, or if you ever want to play again. That's all." Liana stared at the card. Then, without a word, she picked it up and slipped it into her bag. "Come on, Liam," she said, gently lifting her son. Ivy ran up and hugged Liam goodbye, whispering something in his ear that made him smile. Then they were gone, disappearing into the blur of the fair crowd. Elijah watched until they vanished from view. He didn't know why, but the air around him felt different now. He looked down at Ivy, who was watching him carefully, her small fingers wrapped around the edge of her dress. "Daddy," she said. "Are you sad?" He knelt beside her and smoothed her hair. "No, sweetheart. Just thinking. Do you think we'll see them again?" He didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what life would bring next. But deep down, he hoped the answer was yes. Elijah sat in the back seat of the black town car. Ivy nestled beside him, clutching a balloon shaped like a unicorn. She was humming the melody Liana had played, off-key but sincere, her little feet swinging above the floor. He wasn't listening to the notes, he was still replaying the bench, the music, the look in Liana's eyes when she said no. Not many people told him no, especially not people who needed something. The engine hummed as the car passed through the city's outer neighborhoods. Ivy-covered apartments giving way to tired storefronts and sidewalks cracked from years of neglect. Elijah stared out the window, his own reflection overlaying the view. He thought of the card he'd left on the bench. Maybe she'd tear it up. Maybe she'd never call. But maybe she'd think about it. At home. Ivy ran to her room while Elijah poured a glass of scotch and stood by the window of his high-rise apartment. His mind wandered back to Liana's music, the way it had silenced a noisy fairground. He'd attended operas in Vienna, heard private quartets flown in for business dinners, but none of it had left him this quiet. That violin, battered and barely held together, had held more truth than anything in his boardroom. He didn't know what possessed him to reach out again. Maybe it was Ivy. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe something deeper he hadn't touched in years. 3 days passed before the knock came, not at his door, but at his office. He looked up from a folder to find his assistant hesitating at the threshold. "There's a woman downstairs. No appointment. Says she knows you." She paused. "She has a violin case." Elijah stood before she finished. He found Liana waiting in the lobby, Liam holding her hand. She hadn't changed much, still wearing that same worn coat, still carrying the tired look in her eyes. But there was something steadier in her now. She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not here for help," she said before he could speak. "All right, I'm not here for charity." "Understood. I'm only here because my son asked if we'd see the nice girl again, and I didn't want to lie." A silence passed between them. Then Elijah said softly, "Would you like to have dinner with us?" She blinked, taken aback. "Just dinner," he added. "At the apartment. Ivy would be thrilled. And Liam, well, I imagine he'd enjoy the company." Liana hesitated. Her pride still stood tall, but hunger of more than just food was in her posture. She looked at Liam, who stared at the polished marble floors like they were made of gold. "Fine," she said. "Just one dinner. That's all." That night, Elijah set the table himself. Ivy helped, placing napkins crookedly and choosing the blue plates because they looked less scary. The apartment, usually so still, now felt like it was holding its breath. When Liana and Liam arrived, Ivy ran to greet them. No hesitation, no awkwardness, just joy. Dinner was homemade pasta, Elijah's attempt at making something human. The conversation was quiet at first. Liam was shy. Liana was watchful. Elijah tried not to hover. Ivy, that of course, did all the talking. She asked Liam his favorite animal, hippo, his favorite color, orange, and if he knew how to do a cartwheel. He didn't, but she promised to teach him. Liana listened, her expression softening with each word. And then something happened. After dessert, simple chocolate pudding, Ivy pointed to the violin case. "Can you play again?" "Please." Liana looked at Elijah. He didn't answer, just gave the smallest nod. She opened the case. This time, the melody was different. Still haunting, but lighter, sweeter. Liam sat completely still. Ivy rested her head on Elijah's shoulder. And for a few minutes, their broken pieces didn't matter. There was only music, and the safe warmth of a home they didn't know they needed. When the last note faded, no one clapped. They just sat quietly, holding on to the silence. Liana packed the violin slowly. "Thank you for dinner," she said. Elijah walked them to the door. Before they left, he said, "If you ever want to come back, Ivy would love that." Liana turned halfway down the hall. "We'll see." And then she was gone again. But something told him this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something neither of them had planned for, but both were starting to need. The apartment felt too quiet after they left. Ivy had fallen asleep on the couch with a picture book still open on her chest, her breath slow and steady, a faint chocolate smudge on her cheek. Elijah watched her for a moment before gently lifting her into his arms and carrying her to bed. As he tucked her in, her small hand clutched at his fingers. "Will they come back?" she mumbled without opening her eyes. "I hope so," he whispered, brushing a curl from her forehead. Down the hall, Elijah poured himself a drink and stood again at the window. Below him, the city blinked with its usual indifference, bright lights, endless motion. And yet tonight, it felt different. It felt heavier. Or maybe he was just more awake than usual. He sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the echo of Liana's music still lodged in the corners of his mind. But it wasn't her music alone that lingered. It was something else. a memory he hadn't let surface in years. His sister, her name was Maris. She used to call him Eli when no one else dared. She was the only person who ever said he had a heart, even when he swore he didn't. She'd been younger than him by 3 years, full of fire and stubborn love. She dreamed of being a social worker, wanted to open a shelter, talked constantly about helping women like their mother, abused, overlooked, silent. But life hadn't been kind to Maris. Drugs, bad relationships, unpaid bills. And one day, after months of silence, he got a call from a payphone in a rough neighborhood. "I just need help. Eli, just for a few nights. I've got nowhere else." He'd said no. He told himself then that he had reasons, that she'd drag Ivy into danger, that she'd fall again, that he couldn't risk his daughter's safety. But truthfully, he was afraid of her brokenness, afraid it would crack open something inside him. She died 2 weeks later, overdose, alone. He never told Ivy. She was too young. He told himself he'd made the right choice, that it had been necessary. But tonight, watching Liana help her son eat slowly, carefully, with the same dignity Maris once fought to keep, he realized just how much he had let fear win. The next morning, he woke early, restless. He called his therapist, Dr. Hamilton, a man with kind eyes and a brutal memory. In the quiet of the office, Elijah spoke without filter. "There's a woman, single mom, brilliant, strong. I helped her, and now, I don't know. I feel," he paused, "like I'm walking backwards through something I thought I'd buried." Dr. Hamilton leaned forward. "You're not walking backward. You're finally turning around to face it." Elijah didn't answer. His throat was tight. "You see Maris in her." He nodded. "But it's more than that. You see who you could have been if you had chosen differently." Later that day, as Elijah sat in the empty conference room at his foundation, watching the numbers on his tablet flicker, he felt the hollowness again. All the grants, all the partnerships, they didn't feel like enough. Not anymore. He thought of Liana's hands, scarred but steady, the way she watched Liam eat first, the way she played like the world depended on it. She didn't need saving. She needed space to rise again, and maybe so did he. That evening, he found himself standing outside a small arts building the foundation owned but hadn't used in years. The windows were dusty, the locks rusted, but the bones were strong. It used to host music lessons for inner-city kids. The program had been cut during a round of budget restructuring he'd approved. Now he saw what it could be again. A place to teach, a place to play, a place for someone like Liana. He took out his phone. His thumb hovered over her number for a long time. He hadn't used it since she left the dinner table. He wasn't even sure she'd saved his. Finally, he sent a simple message. "Would you consider visiting an old building with me?" Not for help, for possibility. He waited. 5 minutes, 10, an hour. No reply. But he didn't delete the message, because for the first time in years, Elijah wasn't trying to fix someone else. He was trying to fix himself. Liana didn't answer the message that night. She saw it, of course. Read it while sitting at the foot of the twin mattress she and Liam shared at Miss Dolores's place, a 2-bedroom apartment already full with 3 other families. She read it once, then again, then again. Not for help, for possibility. What did that even mean? She set the phone down without replying, feeling the weight of the past pressing hard against her chest. Elijah Cole might have meant well, but men like him always did it first. They helped. Until they realized your brokenness wasn't convenient. Until your presence made things complicated. Until pity wore off and pride kicked in. But Liam had looked so happy at dinner. Ivy had made him laugh in a way she hadn't seen in months. And when Liana played just for a moment, she had felt like herself again. Not a burden, not a charity case, just a woman doing what she was born to do. She didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, while Liam was still dozing in the corner under a pile of mismatched blankets, she stood in the small shared kitchen and sent a reply. Okay, tomorrow, noon, the next day. She met Elijah in front of the old arts building, Liam's hand in hers. She wore the cleanest clothes she had, a faded white blouse and black slacks that barely fit anymore. Elijah stood at the gate, dressed down again, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. His smile was careful, measured, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there at the fair. He pushed open the creaky metal gate and motioned her inside. The building was dusty, silent, abandoned for years. Light filtered through the high windows, catching particles that danced like ash in the air. The paint peeled in corners, and some of the wooden floors creaked loudly beneath their steps. But there was space. There was promise. There used to be a music program here, Elijah said as they walked past cracked chairs and empty shelves. Before budgets got tight, before I let numbers matter more than people. She didn't say anything, just ran her fingers over the keys of an old upright piano tucked in the corner, out of tune, but still holding on. What do you want from me? She asked finally. I don't want anything from you, he said. I want to offer something to you. Liana turned to face him. Why? Elijah looked at Liam, then at her. Because I should have done this a long time ago for someone else. And because my daughter's asking questions I can't answer. Like why someone who plays that beautifully doesn't have a place to do it. Liana let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. What would I even do here? Whatever you want, he said. Music therapy, violin classes, community recitals. You choose, we renovate it, make it yours. I'll fund it, but you run it. She laughed, bitter at first, then quieter. I'm not used to people offering power. I'm not used to offering it without control, he admitted. But maybe it's time we both try something new. There was silence between them. Liam wandered to the center of the room and spun in slow circles beneath the light. Ivy wasn't there, but Liana could almost hear her laughter echoing off the walls. Finally, Liana nodded. Once, I'll try, she said, but on my terms. Elijah smiled. That's the only way it works. By the following week, the building came alive again. Volunteers cleaned. Plumbers and painters arrived. The foundation gave a quiet green light to what was now being called the Harmony Center. And Liana walked in each morning with her back straighter, her voice stronger, her hands steadier. She taught a free music hour twice a week for children from the neighborhood. Word spread fast. They came in sneakers and patched up backpacks, holding recorders and secondhand violins, waiting for the woman who played like the world mattered again. She didn't smile much at first, but each day, the crease between her brows softened. Elijah visited often, always quietly, watching from the doorway as Liam sat beside her during class, or as she tuned an old cello brought in by a shy teenager. He didn't interrupt. He just watched. And one evening, as she walked past him, Liana said the first words that felt like more than just politeness. Thank you for choosing possibility. He didn't respond right away. He just looked at her and realized that for the first time in his life, he had chosen to build something not for profit, not for recognition, but for redemption. And it felt like breathing. The Harmony Center bloomed faster than anyone expected. Within 3 weeks, Liana had created a sanctuary. Mornings were filled with the soft hum of practice scales, afternoons with group lessons and laughter. Word traveled quietly at first among struggling parents, school counselors, and local churches. Children who had never touched an instrument before now carried second-hand violins like treasure. Teenagers found purpose in organizing shelves, tuning instruments, and helping younger ones learn their first notes. Liana came alive in that space. Her posture shifted, her voice, once cautious and quiet, now carried a firm and gentle authority. She still wore simple clothes, still refused charity. But when she stepped into the classroom, she wasn't just a woman surviving, she was a teacher, a leader, an artist again. Elijah stayed in the background. He didn't take credit, didn't make announcements. He'd simply show up on Thursdays after his meetings, sometimes with Ivy, sometimes alone, and sit near the back, watching. Ivy and Liam had grown inseparable, always sitting side by side during lessons, giggling under their breath while Liana pretended not to notice. But silence, as always, doesn't last. One Friday morning, everything changed. It started with a photograph, an innocent snapshot taken by a parent during a recital planning session. Liana stood in front of the room, violin in hand, her other arm resting lightly on Elijah's shoulder as she explained something to the kids. Liam and Ivy sat in the front row, heads touching. The caption was simple: "This is what community healing looks like." The image was shared on a local community blog, then picked up by a bigger one, then a local news outlet. And then, within days, it exploded. Billionaire CEO seen with single mother in community arts revival. Is Elijah Cole falling for a former homeless musician? From boardroom to backstreet, CEO's secret life in forgotten neighborhood revealed. By Monday, the media swarmed the Harmony Center. News vans parked on the sidewalk. Cameras pressed against the windows. Liana tried to shield the children. She canceled 2 classes and stood at the door the next morning, telling reporters, firmly, "This isn't your story to twist," but it was already out. That same evening, Elijah's inbox filled with concern. PR reps from his company begged for a statement. His board scheduled an emergency meeting. Some donors quietly expressed their discomfort. At first, Elijah thought it would pass, but it didn't. On Wednesday, he received a thin, formal envelope. Inside, a request for temporary suspension of leadership pending public clarification. In short, they wanted him to choose his position or whatever this thing was with Liana. He didn't answer them, not right away. Instead, he drove to the Harmony Center just after dusk. The building was dark except for the main room, where Liana was packing away sheet music, moving slowly, as if the air itself had grown heavy. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She didn't turn around. "For what? For dragging you into the storm." "You didn't drag me. The world just doesn't like seeing people cross lines they're supposed to stay behind." He stepped closer. "You did nothing wrong." She looked at him then, tired but steady. "Neither did you, but they'll still make you pay for it." "I don't care," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Yes, you do. You've worked your whole life for that seat at the table." He hesitated. "And what good is a seat if it means sitting at a table that's afraid of truth?" Silence settled. Then, softly, she asked, "Why did you really start this place?" He paused. "Because I couldn't save my sister, and because you reminded me of her, and because I saw who you were. Not the story, not the past, just you." Liana folded the last piece of music into a drawer and closed it gently. "This can't be a charity, not even a personal redemption project. If I'm going to stay, it has to be because I've earned the right, not because I make you feel better about the past." He looked at her, really looked at her. "You've done more than earn it. This place breathes because of you." She nodded once. "Then let me protect it." The next morning, She submitted her resignation, no drama, no anger, just a short note thanking Elijah and the foundation for the opportunity. Elijah read it in silence. Ivy cried when he told her. Liam didn't say anything at all. He just hugged his mom tighter. Elijah went to the board meeting that afternoon, sat through the politics, the warnings, the smiling threats. Then, when it came time for him to speak, he stood and looked every member in the eye. I created the Harmony Center to fix what I ignored for too long. I chose to stand beside a woman who didn't ask for power, only for space to use her voice. If that cost me this seat, so be it. And then he left the room before they could respond. Outside him, the city glowed like nothing had changed. But inside him, everything had. The headlines shifted quickly. CEO defies board, walks away from fortune. Elijah Cole chooses single mom over empire. Opinions clashed across media platforms. Some praised his decision as brave. Others called it reckless. Speculation spun wildly. Was it romance? Was it guilt? Was it some midlife reinvention? Elijah ignored it all. But the truth was quieter than the headlines. He hadn't walked away for Liana. He walked away because the version of himself that sat at that boardroom table, the one who measured people by outcomes and reduced potential to spreadsheets, was no longer someone he could live with. Still, the price of transformation was steep. His phone stopped ringing. Some friends distanced themselves politely. A few partnerships fell through. The apartment, once filled with calls and plans and obligations, now felt like an abandoned shell. For the first time in years, he had nothing in his hands to control, no role to retreat into, no armor left to wear, and he hadn't heard from Liana since she walked out of the Harmony Center. Days blurred. Ivy noticed the silence first. She no longer asked about violin class. No more bedtime songs or afternoon drawings with Liam. Just quiet meals and long looks at her father. One night, as Elijah tucked her in, she looked up and whispered, "You miss them too, don't you?" He nodded, but said nothing. "I liked her," she said softly. "She made you softer." Her words sank like a stone. That same night, Elijah stayed up until dawn, pacing the apartment. He played Liana's music on his phone, found an old video someone had posted from the early days of the center. The sound was scratchy, but the melody carried. He closed his eyes, letting it fill the cracks in his chest. And he wondered, how do you rebuild something that no longer wants to be rescued? 2 days later, there was a knock at his door. He didn't expect it. Not this late, not in the rain. When he opened it, Liana stood there drenched, exhausted, and quiet. Liam was asleep on her back in a wrap, her coat soaked through, but her eyes were clear. "I shouldn't be here," she said. He stepped aside without a word, and she entered. She laid Liam on the couch, covered him with a dry blanket, then stood in the middle of the room like she didn't know where to go. Her fingers trembled slightly. Elijah handed her a towel, and she took it without meeting his eyes. "I didn't leave because of the press," she said finally. "I left because I was afraid of becoming someone I didn't recognize. I worked so hard to stand on my own, and I didn't want to fall into someone else's shadow." "You never were in mine," he said. "If anything, I was standing in yours." She looked up then, tired, worn, but still proud. "I lost everything once," she continued, "and I survived. But this time, I didn't want to just survive. I wanted to matter." "You do," he said. "You always did." She lowered herself into the armchair, hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking about what it means to belong, not just to a building or a job, but to people, to something bigger." He sat across from her. "I've been thinking about that too." They sat in silence. The kind that comes not from distance but from understanding. Rain tapped against the windows. Liam stirred in his sleep but didn't wake. "I don't want charity," she said softly. "I'm not offering it," he replied. "I'm offering partnership, on your terms." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll come back," she said, "but not to perform, and not to decorate your legacy. I'll come back to lead, to rebuild, to grow something real." And if anyone asks why, he interrupted gently, "Let them ask." She smiled faintly, then leaned back in the chair, her guard beginning to fall for the first time in a long while. "Then let's start again," she said, "not with promises, not with debts, but with truth." And in that moment, without title, without power, without pretense, they became something neither of them had expected to find. Two people who had lost everything, finding, finally, something worth building together. They didn't announce her return. There were no press releases, no ribbon cuttings, no photographs. Just one morning. The lights flicked back on inside the Harmony Center, and Liana walked through the doors holding Liam's hand. She wore the same worn violin case over her shoulder, but this time her steps were steady, not cautious, not hesitant. She moved like she belonged there. Elijah followed a few minutes later, holding 2 paper bags, breakfast sandwiches, and hot cocoa. Ivy trailed behind him, skipping up the front steps. The staff didn't ask questions. They only smiled. Inside, the place was just as they had left it, slightly disorganized. Some supplies still stacked in corners, but full of potential. Within days, the children returned. Not because of any advertisement, but because word spread the music teacher was back. And something was different now. This wasn't just a center anymore. It was a sanctuary, not only for children needing rhythm, but for single mothers who needed silence broken gently, for teenagers seeking purpose, for men coming out of recovery who wanted to fix more than broken instruments. Liana expanded the programming. She didn't ask for permission, she just did it. She brought in a local retired percussionist to lead drum circles on Saturdays. She started a mother-child music hour on weekday mornings. Elijah quietly funded everything she asked for, never once telling her how to do it. And Elijah, he stayed involved but not in charge. He swept floors, carried chairs, drove the old foundation van. Sometimes he just sat in the back and listened. It was the most honest work he'd done in years. Then came the idea that changed everything. It started with Ivy's soft voice at the dinner table. "Can we do a concert?" "For real?" Liana raised an eyebrow, amused. "What do you mean?" "With lights and chairs and tickets and everything, so the kids can show what they've learned." Elijah set down his fork. "A winter recital." Liana hesitated. The last time she performed in front of a crowd, she had nothing left to lose. But now, this was different. This was about giving others a voice. She nodded slowly. "Yes, we'll make it beautiful." Preparations began immediately. Flyers printed on donated paper, children choosing their pieces, nervous fingers rehearsing scales. Volunteers painted the walls. Neighbors donated folding chairs and string lights. One of the teens made a banner by hand that read, "We hear you." Liana poured herself into every detail. She stayed late, adjusting seating arrangements, coaching a 6-year-old through her stage fright, stitching hems on performance clothes donated by the church. Elijah, always nearby, never pushed. But every now and then, their hands would brush in passing and neither of them would pull away. The center became more than a building. It became a home for those who hadn't known what one felt like. One evening, just before closing, a young mother lingered in the hallway, her toddler playing with blocks nearby. She approached Liana quietly. I used to be afraid of places like this, she said. Felt like I didn't deserve help unless I was desperate. But this feels different. Liana smiled. It's not help. It's community. You already belong here. The woman's eyes welled. She nodded and said, "Thank you," before gathering her son and heading out into the night. Liana stood still after she left, looking around the room, taking in what they had built. It wasn't grand. It wasn't perfect, but it was healing, and it was real. The recital was only a few days away. The children practiced late, parents baked cookies, Elijah and Ivy wrapped handmade gifts for each performer, and late one night, as Elijah locked the doors behind them, Liana leaned against the wall beside him. "You were right," she said, "about what it wasn't about saving people." He turned to her, quiet. It was about giving them a room to breathe, to remember who they are. He smiled faintly. "You gave them that." She looked up at him, eyes steady. "We did." And in that still moment, neither of them needed to say what they both already knew. This wasn't the end of something broken. It was the beginning of something whole. The night of the recital arrived with a hush in the air, the kind of stillness that comes just before snow. The Harmony Center was glowing strings of warm lights crisscrossed the ceiling, reflecting off the windows. Paper snowflakes hung from the walls, handmade by the children. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows. The faint scent of cinnamon cookies and pine drifted through the hall. Liana stood backstage with her clipboard, checking off names, calming shaking hands, straightening crooked bow ties and hair ribbons. She wore a long black skirt and a deep green blouse, simple, elegant, hers. The violin case sat beside her, closed for now. Elijah walked the aisles, greeting parents and neighbors, helping elderly guests find seats. Ivy clung to his arm for most of it, too excited to sit still. Liam stood by the curtain, peeking out at the crowd, his eyes wide. The audience filled quickly: families, foundation partners, even a few former donors who'd once questioned the project. Some came out of curiosity, most came out of gratitude. Liana stepped to the microphone and gently tapped it. The room fell quiet. "Thank you," she said. "Tonight is not just about music. It's about courage, about second chances, about the sound of voices once silenced finding rhythm again." Then she stepped back and let the children take the stage. One by one, they performed. A young girl with a trembling flute, a teen boy who sang in a voice still changing, cracking once but recovering with a smile. A trio of siblings on mismatched violins, slightly out of tune, but completely in sync with one another. The audience clapped after each performance, not polite applause, but real, thunderous joy. Then Ivy stepped forward. She wore a silver dress and held herself upright like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. She played a simple piano piece, nothing flashy, just the lullaby Liana had once played at the fair. Her fingers faltered once, and she looked to the side where Elijah and Liana stood together. They smiled. She continued. When she finished, the applause rose like a wave, but the room didn't quiet. The children stayed on stage, forming a circle. Then Liana stepped forward again, this time with her violin in hand. She didn't speak. She lifted the instrument to her shoulder and began to play. It was the same melody she'd played the first time Elijah heard her, but it had changed. It was fuller now, layered with warmth, the edges rounded by hope. Her fingers moved with purpose, not proving anything to anyone, only telling a story. As she played, Elijah watched the faces around him, parents leaning forward, children resting against each other, a few wiping away tears they didn't try to hide. It wasn't just a recital, it was a homecoming, the final note held in the air like breath and then silence. Then came the standing ovation. It wasn't loud. It was reverent. A room full of people rising in unison, not out of duty, but because something in them had been lifted. Liana lowered the violin slowly, blinking hard. Elijah stepped beside her, not to steal the moment, but to anchor it. He took the microphone, cleared his throat, and looked out at the room. I used to believe success was measured in numbers. That achievement was about how high you could climb and how long you could stay there. He looked at Liana, but tonight, I've seen what real success looks like. It's the courage to keep showing up, the bravery to try again, the grace to build something where nothing once stood. He turned back to the crowd. This center, this music is not mine. It never was. It belongs to all of you, and especially to the woman who made it sing again. He stepped back, and for the first time that night, Liana allowed herself a small bow. Later, as the chairs were folded and cookies wrapped in napkins for the road, Ivy ran to Liana, threw her arms around her, and whispered, "You're the best teacher ever." Liana bent down and kissed the top of her head. "You're the best student." Elijah waited by the door. Liana walked over slowly, Liam half asleep on her hip. He looked at her, a softness in his voice. "You're not just building music anymore. You're building a movement." She smiled faintly. "I'm just trying to help them remember they matter." "You reminded me too," he said. And in that moment, under the quiet buzz of fading lights, they stood side by side, not as a man saving a woman, not as a woman proving herself, but as two people rebuilding a world they could finally believe in. Together. The weeks that followed the recital unfolded like a quiet miracle. Snow blanketed the city in soft white, muffling its usual chaos. Inside the Harmony Center, the music didn't stop. If anything, it deepened. Children returned again and again, even during holiday break, just to sit in the warmth of the rooms, to practice, to belong. Liana had become more than just a teacher now. She was the heartbeat of the place. Families came to her not only with musical questions, but with broken schedules, worries about rent, and children afraid of returning to school. She answered with the same grace she brought to her bow, measured, firm, gentle. Elijah stayed close, but never in the way. He showed up when she needed backup, stepped aside when she didn't. The transformation in him had moved beyond the surface. His eyes had softened. He laughed more. He listened instead of solving. But the truth was, they were orbiting something bigger now, something unspoken but undeniable. One evening in early January, as Liana locked the front doors after a long day, Elijah waited beside the van. Ivy and Liam sat in the back, laughing about something neither adult could quite hear. "You look tired," he said as she approached. "I'm not tired," she replied. "I'm full." They stood in the cold for a moment, their breath rising in visible clouds, snowflakes clinging to Liana's hair. Then Elijah opened the passenger door for her. She paused, then stepped in. That night, instead of dropping her off at the crowded apartment she'd been rotating through with other single mothers, he asked quietly, "Have you ever considered living somewhere more stable, just for now?" She turned toward him. "You mean your guest house?" He hesitated. "Yeah, it's just a few steps from the main house. Private, warm, safe. You'd be near the center. And the kids could, I don't know, just be kids." Liana looked at him, long and hard. "You know I don't want charity." "This isn't charity," he said softly. "This is space, until you build your own." She didn't answer right away. But when Ivy leaned over the seat and asked, "Can we all have breakfast together tomorrow?" Liana only nodded. The guest house was modest but beautiful. 2 bedrooms, tall windows, a small kitchen. Elijah made no speeches. He simply handed her the keys and walked away. That night, after tucking Liam into a real bed, Liana stood by the window, watching the lights from the main house flicker in the distance. She felt something unfamiliar pressing against her ribs. Peace. The next few weeks settled into a quiet rhythm. Mornings began with shared coffee between the houses. Elijah read the news while Liana packed lunches for the kids. Ivy and Liam chased each other between porches, snow boots leaving scattered prints in the yard. On weekends, they cooked together. Liana taught Ivy how to make cornbread. Elijah surprised them by making a perfect omelet. One Sunday evening, Liana and Elijah sat on the back steps of the guest house, watching the sun dip behind the city skyline. The children were inside, building something with blankets and couch cushions. "You ever think about what this is?" Elijah asked. Not looking at her, Liana tilted her head. This life, us, this whole strange, accidental family." She was quiet for a long moment. "I think it's the first time I've had something that doesn't feel like it'll be taken away." He turned to her. "It won't." She looked at him then, eyes unreadable. "What are you afraid of?" He smiled faintly. "Not being enough. Not knowing how to hold something good without breaking it." Liana's voice was low. "Then don't try to hold it. Just show up for it." He nodded. That he could do. Later that night, as they cleaned up after dinner and the children fell asleep mid-conversation on the couch, Elijah walked Liana to the door. Before she stepped inside, she turned and looked at him for a long time. "You never asked me to stay," she said. "I was afraid you'd say no." She smiled gently. "I'm still here, aren't I?" Then, with a soft touch to his hand, she stepped inside. Elijah stood in the doorway for a moment after, heart quiet but full. This wasn't the life he had planned. It wasn't polished or simple or even guaranteed, but it was real. It was a home. And this time, he wasn't standing outside it. He was part of it. Snow fell again that weekend, soft and slow, like the world had learned to breathe gently. Inside the guest house, Ivy and Liam sprawled on the living room rug, building an elaborate cardboard city with paper roads and crayon-drawn trees. Liana sat nearby, tuning a student's violin, while Elijah stirred a pot of soup on the stove. The scent of thyme and roasted vegetables filled the space, warmth layered over warmth. Everything about the evening was simple, and yet, beneath the quiet, something waited unspoken but deeply felt. Liana looked up from the violin and caught Elijah watching her from the kitchen, not staring, just there, present, grounded in a way he hadn't been when they first met. She smiled without caution now, and he smiled back. No mask in sight. Dinner was quiet, not silent, but easy, familiar. Afterward, Ivy curled up on the couch between them, her eyelids drooping. Liam was already asleep on a cushion on the floor, one sock halfway off. And then, just as Elijah reached for a blanket to drape over them, Ivy's voice, soft and unsure, broke the stillness. "Are we a family now?" The words hung in the room like a held breath. Liana froze, her hand still resting on Ivy's shoulder. Elijah looked at her, not to answer for her, but to see if she'd answer first. Liana's fingers gently smoothed Ivy's hair. She didn't laugh, didn't deflect. She just whispered, "What do you think?" Ivy blinked slowly. "It feels like we are." Liana nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "Then maybe we already are." Elijah leaned forward, resting his hand lightly over Liana's. Her fingers didn't flinch. He looked at Ivy. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who stays when it matters most. She yawned and nestled deeper between them. Then I hope we stay forever. The room was still again. Not the aching kind of still, but the sacred kind. Outside, the world carried on cars past. Wind shifted, news flashed. But here, in this small space they had all stumbled into, something had rooted itself, not out of convenience, not out of rescue, but out of truth. A billionaire who learned to sit still, a woman who found her voice again, a little girl who believed kindness could change the world, and a boy who smiled now without fear. There were no papers signed, no grand declarations, no promises made with fireworks. Just a question from a child, and the courage to say yes, even without knowing what tomorrow would bring. Later that night, when the children were asleep, Liana and Elijah stood in the kitchen together, side by side, washing dishes by hand. He glanced at her. "Do you ever wonder how one question changed everything?" She looked at him, eyes full. "It didn't change everything. It just reminded us what mattered." And as they stood there, in the quiet rhythm of water and warmth, they knew this wasn't a happy ending. It was a beginning, one built not on saving, but on seeing, not on fixing, but on showing up, not on perfection, but on presence. And all of it, every second of it, started with one little girl tugging her father's sleeve and saying, "Daddy, she's hungry. Can we buy it for her?" The answer, it turned out, was more than just yes. It was everything.